Welcome to The Debate, where we dive into the heart of compelling ideas and challenging perspectives. Today, we're unpacking Bill Vincent's influential book, Tuned In, a guide that promises to help us hear God's voice in, well, an incredibly noisy world.
Right. And the big question we're grappling with today is this. Does tuning into God's voice, as described in this material, does it primarily emphasize individual, internal spiritual disciplines just for personal intimacy and guidance? Or does it ultimately serve as preparation for an outward, collective call to active deliverance and revival within the world?
Exactly. And from my perspective, tuning in is fundamentally about cultivating those individual spiritual disciplines for personal intimacy and guidance. It's about fostering a profound internal connection.
And while I agree personal discipline is undeniably important, it's crucial, I'll contend that tuning in is ultimately about equipping believers for an outward, collective role in what the author refers to as deliverance and revival, really preparing them for strategic action in the world.
Okay, so let's start where the book does. Right in Chapter 1, Tuned In explains that tuning in is all about bringing something into harmony. You're refining it for precision, intensity, and effectiveness. Now, to me, that sounds unequivocally like an internal deep dive, wouldn't you say? The author consistently highlights these disciplines of divine adjustment and the absolute necessity of sacred silence, concepts you find woven throughout chapters 1, 3, and 10, to achieve this internal harmony. To truly hear God's voice clearly, the book asserts one must actively silence both internal and, what seems to be perceived as external noise. But what kind of noise are we talking about? The author specifically identifies these as things like the worry channel, the offense channel, and the nostalgia channel right there in Chapter 1. Look, these aren't external broadcasts. They're our own internal mental and emotional preoccupations.
Okay.
He further discusses muting things like social media, busyness, or stubbornness. That's from Chapter 2. And what he calls the clutter of worldly concerns, the noise of ungodly influences, and the static of unresolved sin from Chapter 6. Notice how even worldly concerns and ungodly influences are framed as static, something that interferes with our personal reception. A key component of this tuning in, as discussed in Chapters 3 and 4, is fostering honesty in relationship with God, allowing for even lament and vulnerability in prayer. This is deeply personal stuff. The material repeatedly points to the still small voice of God. That's in Chapters 6 and 7, a voice that requires personal stillness and quiet reflection. And the core insight here, I think, is that God's voice isn't limited to these grand spiritual encounters. It often manifests in the most mundane, everyday moments. The book cites relatable examples, like hearing God most clearly in the bathroom or lying in bed, Chapter 3, or even, in the shower or on the toilet in Chapter 7. This really challenges the common assumption that spiritual connection requires extraordinary settings. Instead, it emphasizes accessibility through simple, personal stillness. Ultimately, from my reading, the undeniable goal here is clearer personal reception of God's voice for individual guidance and an unhindered, intimate communion with Him. It makes it a deeply individual journey.
Okay, look, I certainly don't dispute the profound importance of personal listening and internal refinement. The book is absolutely replete with examples of that. However, I think that Tuned In consistently frames these individual disciplines as a means to a larger outward end. It's not just about personal comfort. It feels much more like preparing for a strategic deployment in the world.
Deployment.
Yeah, the book explicitly asserts in Chapter 6 that tuning into God's voice is not just beneficial, but essential for every facet of our lives, our relationships, careers, ministries. And here's the key phrase for me, because we live in a critical hour where the Spirit is speaking to the church. Now, what Vincent seems to mean by a critical hour isn't just, a general sense of urgency. It seems to be a specific belief that we are in a unique, pivotal time for spiritual awakening, and that God is speaking to the church as a collective body, not just individuals in isolation, about this specific moment.
Okay.
This perspective really shifts the emphasis, I think, from personal comfort to preparing for a broader spiritual context. The material connects individual obedience to running a race and taking divine pit stops for ultimate victory. That's chapter 5. Now, this isn't just a solo sprint for personal piety. It really suggests a collective, impactful journey that goes far beyond individual spiritual growth. There's a clear, urgent call to ascend Zion as deliverers, a phrase repeated across chapters 12, 13, 15, and 16. To ascend Zion here seems to mean rising to a place of spiritual authority and influence, and deliverers are those who bring spiritual freedom and transformation to others, often through prayer or maybe spiritual warfare. This is about being part of the army God is raising, mentioned in chapters 12 and 16. A collective force, definitely not a lone pilgrim.
An army, right.
Yeah, and this army is specifically called to carry his fire into a broken world, chapter 12, which implies actively bringing God's presence and power to others. They are commissioned to dismantle this stronghold of what the author terms the Esau spirit. That's in chapters 12, 13, 14. This Esau spirit, drawing from the biblical narrative, represents a tendency to prioritize immediate gratification or temporary comfort over long-term spiritual inheritance and divine purpose, something that hinders collective progress. Ultimately, the goal is to bring revival, deliverance, chapter 17, leading to America Wakened, chapter 16. That's a specific call for national spiritual transformation, not just individual change. Even the book review cited mentions prophetic insight and practical application, urging readers towards active obedience and divine partnership. This active, outward role is further underscored by the idea of becoming revelators of divine secrets in chapter 16, those who receive and then declare divine truths for others. So, my contention is that tuning in equips believers for significant, active ministry and global transformation, making the outward impact the ultimate purpose.
You've certainly laid out a powerful case for that outward focus. However, I think the nature of the noise and clutter the book describes really reinforces the idea that the primary battleground for clarity is, well, an internal one. The material's focus for me consistently targets internal distractions and unconfessed sin. Chapter 1, for instance, speaks of spiritual channels we have no business watching, like the worry channel or the offense channel. These aren't external societal issues per se. They are intrinsic, emotional, and mental preoccupations within us. Chapter 6 similarly highlights hidden sins and unresolved sin as interference, clearly pointing to a personal, moral battleground, a blockage in our internal communication line with God. We see further metaphors in chapter 10 referring to cluttered closets of our souls, and chapter 11 to the junk under the bed. All very vivid imagery for internal spiritual tidiness. These aren't calls to clean up the world's closets, right? They're calls to clean up our own. This perspective emphasizes that the battle for clarity in hearing God is fought first and foremost within oneself by purifying one's inner environment. The goal is to get our inner radio clear so we can receive God's voice for our lives. It feels like it's about personal spiritual hygiene for personal reception.
Okay, advocate, while you've effectively highlighted the personal side of internal noise, how do you reconcile that with the book's clear directives about confronting external societal noise and systems? Because while internal static is certainly a factor, the material also points to significant external noise that needs to be confronted, seemingly for the sake of collective impact. Chapter 14, for instance, in its discussion of the Daniel choice, explicitly refers to Babylon's system and the seduction of its culture as a form of intoxication that must be refused. Now, Babylon's system isn't just an internal thought. In Vincent's work, it seems to refer to worldly systems, structures, cultural values that oppose God's kingdom and can, intoxicate believers away from their spiritual calling. That sounds like a societal structure, an external influence that demands a conscious choice to refuse.
A choice, yes.
And chapter 3 mentions competing stations of worldly agendas that clamor for bandwidth. These are not solely internal distractions, are they? They feel like external forces seeking to divert collective attention and purpose. The noise isn't just personal distraction, it's also presented as societal compromise and spiritual stagnation. That deliverers, those called to bring spiritual freedom, are called to actively confront and dismantle, as we see in chapter 12, for revival to actually happen. This implies that clearing the static involves more than just personal quietude. It's preparing to collectively project a divine signal into the world, thereby changing the external noise and environment for others. So while personal tidiness is maybe a starting point, it doesn't feel like the end goal when the book talks about Babylon.
That's a critical distinction, and I appreciate you emphasizing those external references. However, even when the book mentions Babylon's system, isn't it often in the context of an individual's choice to resist its seduction? Like you said, the Daniel choice? It seems to be about maintaining personal integrity within a corrupted system, precisely to preserve one's ability to hear God clearly. So while you're right that external forces exist, the book's core message for me remains that the power to resist them comes from that internal clarity.
Which brings us to the purpose of obedience. I see why you emphasize the collective impact, but I would offer a slightly different perspective. Obedience, as presented in chapters like Clearing the Static, how obedience that's chapter 8, seems primarily crucial for maintaining personal alignment and ensuring uninterrupted dialogue and clarity with God for ourselves. The text states that immediate action on God's commands clears static from the line, again, chapter 8, directly linking it to one's personal reception. Think about it. If you don't obey, your own ability to hear diminishes. The library book example in chapter 8 is quite powerful here. It illustrates how delayed obedience is costly obedience, primarily in terms of one's personal ability to hear God's voice, highlighting the individual consequence of spiritual congestion. The consequence described isn't that a collective movement gets derailed, but that your spiritual hearing is hampered.
It feels like it's about maintaining a clear, direct, personal connection for effective individual guidance so that we can hear what we need to do for our own journey, not necessarily what the collective needs to do first. This foundational individual clarity is maybe what makes any outward action possible later on.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that it's solely for personal clarity. Let me explain why. While individual clarity is definitely a component, the book portrays obedience as a strategic move within a much larger spiritual race. Back to chapter 5, where divine pit stops of prayer and stillness are taken for ultimate victory. Now, this doesn't sound like just a personal race. It feels collective, especially when linked to the call for an army in chapter 12, which implies a shared objective, right?
Well,
Obedience is framed as unlocking God's promises and activating pipelines, not just for personal benefit, but for what the book calls big success. That's chapters 5 and 18, and the outward manifestation of divine deposits and contagious anointing from chapter 18. Now, divine deposits seem to refer to spiritual resources or gifts God places within believers, and contagious anointing suggests a discernible, transferable spiritual power that impacts others. These aren't concepts tied to merely maintaining an individual connection. They are clearly about outward influence and empowerment.
Okay. Influence, yes.
And consider the Daniel choice in chapter 14 again. Daniel's refusal of Babylon's feast leads to an excellent spirit that positions him for promotion. This isn't just about internal purity. Promotion in this context implies an outward role of distinction and influence within a societal structure, allowing for greater impact. His obedience created a platform for broader influence, didn't it? This obedience seems clearly for power and impact in ministry and the transformation of the world, serving a much broader, collective purpose than just keeping an individual's line of communication clear. It feels like it's about being effective for others.
You make a compelling point about the scale of the impact that obedience can have. Daniel's promotion certainly highlights influence, I grant that. But I'm still not convinced that the primary intention of the tuning in and the obedience right from the start is that collective impact. I believe the material strongly emphasizes that the outward actions stem from an already established, deep personal intimacy and clarity. The foundation is always individual tuning, which then enables a person for a greater work, perhaps. But the initial and ongoing emphasis feels personal. Let's look at the open door and ascension. The emphasis here, for me, still leans heavily toward individual revelation. The open door in heaven, described in Revelation 4:1, referenced in chapters 15 and 16, is consistently presented as an invitation to a deeper dimension of spiritual authority and intimacy, chapter 15.
Intimacy, yes, but...
And the concept of higher is deeper in the same chapter strongly suggests that this ascension is less about physical movement or even an immediate collective gathering, and more about spiritual growth into personal revelation and a profound internal connection with God. It's about your spiritual journey upward and inward. The powerful analogy of Moses descending Sinai with a shining face, chapter 15, after dining on the glory of God, illustrates a personal transformation through consuming the living word. This aligns with the idea of eating every word from God in chapter 13 for individual spiritual nourishment and transformation. The shining face, after all, was Moses, wasn't it? A visible sign of his personal encounter with God's glory, not the entire nation's, at least not initially. It's about becoming personally radiant from that intimate encounter first.
That's a compelling argument. And the image of Moses' shining face certainly speaks to a profound individual encounter. No doubt. But the question I keep coming back to is, what does that personal glory lead to? For Moses, it led to leading a nation, right? When the material describes the open door in chapter 15, it's called a portal, a literal or figurative gateway to the revelatory realm, and it explicitly links it to being revelators of divine secrets in chapter 16. Now, what does it mean to be a revelator of divine secrets? It sounds like receiving hidden truths from God and then declaring them.
Declaring them. Okay.
The book specifically states these revelators hear what heaven is saying and deliver it to a hungry generation. Now, that doesn't sound like it's just for personal edification. That's an outward act of spiritual transmission. This ascension into revelation is clearly presented as part of a divine summons to be deliverers ascending Zion, as emphasized in chapters 12, 15, and 16. Deliverers, as we discussed, are those who bring spiritual freedom. This collective ascent is explicitly to carry his fire into a broken world, chapter 12, and see miracles erupt, chapter 17. The invitation is framed as being to this generation to challenge the Esau spirit, chapter 12, that societal tendency toward compromise, explicitly emphasizing a collective commission and the manifestation of God's power through an army, chapters 12, 16, for America's Awakening, chapter 16. America's Awakening is a literal call for widespread spiritual revival and transformation across the nation. So while personal intimacy might be the engine, the ultimate purpose of this open door and ascension seems to be the collective, outward delivery of God's message and power for global impact. I mean, how can you have America's Awakening without a collective, outwardly focused commission driving it?
You're right that the material clearly points to significant outward impact. The Army and America's Awakening are undeniably powerful phrases. My contention isn't that there isn't an outward component, but maybe it's more about the primary emphasis of the act of tuning in itself. For me, those powerful outward movements seem always contingent upon and flow from a deeply cultivated individual tuning in. Without that internal precision and intimacy, the external call potentially loses its foundation and power. The book seems to ground all of it in those personal spiritual disciplines first. It's perhaps not an either-or, but a matter of where the emphasis lies in that initial act of tuning in.
And I would argue the why behind that individual tuning is paramount. It's not presented as an end in itself, like a personal spiritual retreat, but as preparation, even a commissioning for a greater work in the world. The internal clarity is a necessary step, absolutely, but it feels fundamentally geared towards equipping believers to do something collectively.
Indeed. Well, we've explored the rich tension within Bill Vincent's Tuned In, examining whether tuning into God's voice is primarily an individual journey of internal discipline or a preparation for an outward collective role in deliverance and revival. My perspective has highlighted the profound importance of personal alignment, clearing internal static through self-examination and honesty, and fostering intimacy with God through disciplines like sacred silence and immediate obedience. The material, I feel, consistently circles back to individual responsibility in maintaining that clear personal connection, suggesting that this internal work is where the primary emphasis of tuning in truly lies.
And my argument has centered on the idea that these personal preparations, while absolutely essential and foundational, are ultimately steps toward a much larger mandate: to participate actively in God's kingdom work, carrying His fire, dismantling spiritual strongholds like the Esau spirit, and ushering in revival and deliverance for the world. The individual is sharpened, refined, and made intimately aware of God's voice, precisely so they can become an effective part of a collective army aimed at global transformation.
It's certainly clear the material presents compelling arguments for both perspectives, really underscoring the dynamic and multifaceted nature of hearing God's voice. The interplay between personal spiritual growth and collective impact is a powerful theme throughout the book.
Absolutely. And the question of emphasis, whether the internal process is the ultimate goal or perhaps a necessary precursor to outward action, is one that listeners are invited to consider for themselves, reflecting on how these insights resonate with their own journey and understanding of the material. There is definitely much more to explore within this rich text, and this debate, I hope, illuminates just how complex and inspiring it truly is.